Thank you for that nice introduction. So I actually prepared a really good presentation for you guys today, and this morning I had a conference call where I had to download a startup company's beta version of their software. And needless to say, it completely destroyed my computer. But that's a good metaphor for emerging markets venture capital. Because you're always facing adversity and you need to really rise to the challenge. So anyway, it's a pleasure to be here. And I guess the format is going to be, I'm going to talk for 15 minutes. Then he's going to talk for 15 minutes and explain a little bit about the private equity side. And then we'll open things up for your questions. So I guess I'll just go through very quickly a few things that I find sort of fascinating and interesting about the Brazilian venture capital market and Brazil in general. And then we can go from there. So I guess I'd like to start with a question. And the question is really, does anyone know what the largest unexplored resource is in Brazil? So some people might say oil, other people might say minerals, other people? Human capital. Very good. That's the answer. Okay. So you get a gold star for the day. And not just human capital, but it's really, if I had to name one strong competitive advantage of Brazil, I would say it's the opportunity to aggregate human capital. So Brazil is a country, as you know, of around 200 million people. And it's not that the Brazilian engineers or entrepreneurs or what have you are any smarter than the best engineers and entrepreneurs in the US, in China, in India, in Nigeria, and whatever country. But what it is it's a lack of opportunities. So the business culture in Brazil is still sort of like business culture in the US was in the 1970s, in the sense that engineers, for example, are sort of treated as second-class citizens, and they're sort of nameless automatons in the annals of the big banks in Sao Paulo writing encryption algorithms and things of that nature. Versus if you look at the revolution in Silicon Valley, the engineers really are now at the front of companies and really involved in the process. So the takeaway from that is if you're able to start an interesting company, you're really going to be able to attract talent in a way that you couldn't elsewhere, because it's not like Silicon Valley. So for example, let's think of engineers here. They can work for Google, they can work for Microsoft, they can work for Amazon, Twitter, Zynga, Facebook, and probably thousands of startups. But in Brazil, there's not as many opportunities for top engineers. So if you open something, there's a chance, and you do things the right way, there's a chance for you to really aggregate human talent, and that'll be a strong competitive advantage that you'll have. So sounds pretty easy, right? But unfortunately, it's not that easy. And there's a couple reasons why that's the case. So in Brazil, there's not as much geographic mobility. So for example, I was born in New York. I lived in New York for the first 18 years of my life. Then I lived in the Midwest. Then I moved back to New York. Then I lived in the Midwest again. Then I moved back to New York. Then I lived in the Bay Area. Then I lived in St. Thomas in the Caribbean. Then I lived in the Bay Area, and now I live in Brazil. That would almost never happen in Brazil. So normally, if you're from a state like Minas Gerais, where my fund is based, you're born in Minas Gerais and you die in Minas Gerais. It's not like you go away to college in a different state. So that has a lot of implications, and one of those implications is that you typically live with your family until you get married. Okay. What does that mean for a startup? What that means is that a career decision is not an individual decision, it's a family decision. And since startups are not really recognized as a valid career option, it's very hard to recruit for a startup. Because think of the US, okay? I think when I look back, I think the first time that it really, as we use in Portuguese expression, caiu a ficha, or it sort of, how would you explain that? It set in, like people understood that startups was a valid career choice, in American popular culture was all those stories about the Microsoft millionaires, the janitors and secretaries and other people who worked at Microsoft and then wound up through their stock options becoming millionaires. Unfortunately, Brazil hasn't had a case like that. So when you're trying to convince people to join a startup or trying to convince their families to let them join a startup, that's a big hurdle. Another big hurdle is that employees don't value stock options. So when you're recruiting for an early stage startup, you don't have a lot of money, right? And so it's very hard to convince people to say these pieces of paper might someday make you rich, because there have been very few cases like that in Brazil. So that's kind of another difficult side. But just to give you the culture, the solution really quickly, the solution to that is culture. And that is that if you treat people humanely, if you empower them by giving them a sense of participation in the direction of the company, if you do various things that are the opposite of the traditional large Brazilian companies, you're actually able to win them over and you're able to do startups. Very quickly, let me jump to the difference between venture capital in the US and venture capital in Brazil. Venture capital in the US, very close to Sand Hill Road, you can go to any VC firm and there'll be a partner that specializes in consumer-facing internet companies, another partner that specializes in synthetic biology, another partner whose focus is regenerative medicine, and another her exclusive focus is, optical networking. So there's specialization. In emerging markets venture capital, however, that's not the case. You typically need to cast a much wider net, and also the market isn't as developed, so you're not seeing the same deal flow which would allow you to specialize. So you're typically a generalist. So that's one difference. Another big difference is the companies are much more labor intensive. Typically because entrepreneurship is not as mature in emerging markets. So the companies typically aren't as mature. So that means that you really have to do a lot to, lend a helping hand and really get involved feet first with your portfolio companies, because they're not showing up with full teams and, things of that nature. So that's another big difference. And finally, I guess another thing that's really absolutely essential to understand is that, and something that many people get wrong, including very successful venture capitalists, a lot of people conflate venture capital with high technology. In emerging markets, that's absolutely not the case, and it's a big mistake that people make. I think historically, you've gotten exponential growth curves from high technology businesses. But the thing is in emerging markets, you don't necessarily need a high technology company to generate an exponential growth curve. So for example, I've seen mattress companies, parking lot companies, car leasing companies, all kinds of companies that you would never associate with venture capital in the US, and yet they have these growth curves that look just like, Twitter's. So I think you really need to be careful not to what I call the tail wagging the dog, which is conflating, this growth with high technology, when really traditional industries can also yield that. And then finally, and I know we're still kind of pressed for time, I'd like to talk about a few trends that I see in the Brazilian market, and I think it's the conflation of these trends which is really making Brazil such an interesting place to be these days.